Good morning, or well, it's morning for me. Who knows when you're watching this? This is the third lecture in our second week. Today, we're going to be talking about the return of the Doughboys, and basically, we're going to be introducing the 1920s. We're going to have a test the beginning of next week, so we're not going to talk about the 1920s too extensively. But I do want to take this from the perspective of the American men returning, because some Americans were in Europe until 1919. Those were the early returners, but some Americans were still in Europe in 1921, and those Americans that got sent to Russia to guard the Trans-Siberian Railroad didn't get back till 1924. So some of these men are coming back and they're experiencing a world that's completely different than the one they left. And I certainly think it's important to talk about those things and to figure out what in the world is going on. Number one, let's talk about what happened with the peace. Last time we talked about the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson put forward. And by the way, those 14 points were adapted into a treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, although I will point out that it had several significant additions that were very disastrous for Germany. Number one, they limited the size of the German army to approximately 100,000 men. This was effectively enough to defend themselves, but not enough to pose a real threat. Obviously, Adolf Hitler is going to change all that up. Number two, they were severely limited in the amount of war material they could produce. They could have a much smaller fleet than Great Britain. They weren't allowed to build tanks or planes, except in certain specifications. By the way, Hitler would get around both of these restrictions as well. So not really a problem for him, but still something to keep in mind. Finally, and most disastrously, the British and French forced the Germans to accept total responsibility for the war, even though, let's be honest, it was not totally their fault. They also forced Germany to accept reparations for the entire cost of the war for Germany and France. Effectively, Germany had to pay for its own war, and it had to pay Britain and France back for everything that they had spent. Everything. For a nation that was just defeated and had a lot of its territory taken away and couldn't build all of these things and had suffered as many manpower losses as Britain and France did. This is a disaster. Disaster. It's one of the poorest written treaties of all time. And it's going to cause World War II. I mean, if you want to find the cause of World War II, it is the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, even Hitler probably wouldn't have turned into what he turned into had the Treaty of Versailles not been as horrendously bad as it was. So, yeah, Treaty of Versailles, not good. The United States wouldn't sign it. The Treaty of Versailles, they would not sign, not necessarily because they disagreed with the treatment of Germany, although I would hope anyone with some logic could see the problems that would be created by making Germany do what they were going to make them do. But the main reason that the United States wouldn't join it was because of the 14th point. It would not join the League of Nations. They were not going to join a league that effectively had the power to declare war for them. Not going to happen. The Republicans in the Senate said, no, not happening. We will not sign this treaty. And eventually, the United States was forced to sign an independent peace with Germany. In fact, we were at war with Germany for almost a year, technically. No fighting, but we were at war with them a year after the armistice. And eventually, we had kind of put that aside. At the same time, as these GIs came back, a very new and very dangerous ideology began really getting a lot of power in the world, and that is communism. So, for those of you not familiar with communism, let's just talk about it briefly. We're going to go in depth. We're going to talk about communism and how it affects people and the problems that it causes in depth. But let's just do a general overview right now. Communism is a philosophy first put forward by Karl Marx and then modified by several important thinkers, primarily Russian, including Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and then Joseph Stalin. And there's been more development since then, but those are the important names in the development of the theory. Communism says that the problem with the world is that the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, are basically oppressing the working class. They're stealing the products of the working class, and they're not basically compensating them correctly. Communism seeks to correct this by putting everyone on an equal playing field. Everyone has access to goods, and everyone works to the best of their ability. In fact, the kind of slogan of communism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So you go do whatever you're best at, and you get everything provided for you that you need. You get a coat for the winter, you get a house to live in, you get a car, you get a this, you get a that. Sounds pretty good. All of you guys are like, yeah, let's become communists, except it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't work because humans are interesting. We need motivation. And if you don't have any reason to do your job well, you're not going to do it. Think about it. If I offered to have you write a paper and I gave you one of two options, you can either write a 3-page paper, do your absolute best, and I'll give you a grade based on your work, or you can go and you can copy and paste 7 pages from the internet, and I'll give you 100%. Which one are you going to pick? I mean, it's pretty obvious. You're going to pick the one that gives you guaranteed grades. Why would you ever work harder when you could work less hard? Okay, that's a poor example, but it's generally what's going on here. You can go in and you can make a few desks, your desk maker, because I'm looking at desks in my classroom. You're a desk maker. You can go in and you can make 2 desks, or you can work really hard and make 5 desks. And what do you get at the end of the day? Nothing different. So what are you going to do? You're going to make 2 desks. You're going to work less. And that's the reality. And you can try and adjust this. You can say, no, you have to make so many desks. But again, in capitalism, in our society, if you can make 5 desks, you make 5 desks. Why? Because you get rewarded for doing that. You get more stuff. You get more money. Maybe soon you're making your own desks. You start your own company. Pretty soon you're a desk billionaire. Probably not. But, you could. In communism, you could make 1,000 desks a day and you're still getting the same thing as the guy that makes 2 desks or 3 desks or 4 desks. And actually, the reality is because humans are corrupt, the guy down the street who supposedly stamps papers is making twice what you do because he's got friends that will give him extra food and will give him extra clothes and will give him a TV. He's got a TV. How do you get a TV? You can't go buy it. There's no buying TVs in communism. Do you need a TV? No, you don't need a TV. Well, why does that guy need a TV? Because he knows the right people. All right. So communism is problematic, to say the least. We're going to dig into it deep. This is just kind of a general overview. Now, why does communism arrive as an important philosophy? Why does it start causing problems? Well, the answer to that question is simple. Russia falls to communists in October 1917. October 1917. This is called the Communist Revolution. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party take over Russia, and then they spend the next 7 years fighting a Russian civil war. So a fight between the Red Russians, the communists, and the White Russians, the forces of the Tsar, the democratic forces. And they fight for 7 years. Eventually, the Bolsheviks, the Red Russians, win. And the United States is involved in this. The United States stationed troops there. But as the United States watched communism spread and grow more powerful in Russia, it began to be scared that communism would come there because there was this idea. By the way, it gets brought back up in the 1950s by Dwight Eisenhower, that communism, once it starts, will cascade. Not because it's right, but because the working class sees it as an improvement and they're going to go for it. And then they're going to get even worse situation, but they don't know that. They're too dumb to know. So many people in the United States are afraid that communism is going to ripple out. It's going to control everything pretty soon because the stupid workers aren't going to know what's best for them. By the way, can I tell you that human beings in general are not stupid? Okay, a worker probably can figure out whether this is going to be in his best interest or not. Just because he doesn't have a great college education doesn't mean he's not going to be able to figure this out. So I think this was unfounded on Americans' part, but this is what they were worried about. There were strikes and walkouts near the end of the war because of low wages, and the wages were low because they had been kept artificially low during the war. Now, during the war, that's fine. Everybody's feeling patriotic. They're like, yeah, go America. I will work for less because I want my country to succeed. But the war ends, and the big businessmen are like, oh, well, I like low wages. They work for me. And the workers are like, I don't like low wages. I don't want to work for this anymore. I'm not doing it out of patriotism. I'm doing it to support my own family. And soon, some of these discontented workers began forming socialist and communist parties. And in Eastern Europe, there began to be bombings by communist groups trying to bring governments down and install communist regimes. And when the American GIs came back, we had our first Red Scare. What this means is that people were afraid everybody else was a communist. And politicians were pointing the finger at each other. You're a communist. No, you're a communist. Okay. Which, by the way, for the record, it still kind of happens, right? People are like, Bernie Sanders, you're a communist. And maybe he is. That's a good question. But in reality, he's not a communist. And most of the people in the 1920s who were declared to be communists probably weren't communists either. It was just a political smear. Like, you're incompetent, you're a communist, or you're far left, you're a communist. It's just kind of an insult that starts to get thrown around. But some people take this really seriously. Like they're prepping to fight off the communists because they're going to take over the country. So this is something that the Americans have to deal with when they come back. The most famous incident of these are called the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States, and he was so afraid of the communists that he created a new government agency called the FBI. And the FBI's purpose when it was first created, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, by the way, if you didn't know what that means, the Federal Bureau of Investigations' purpose when it was first created is to go and break into people's houses and make sure they're not communists. I kid you not. And so in the middle of the night, the FBI would break people's doors down, drag them out into the streets, and because they were suspected of communists, and they would ransack the house looking for any communication with the Russians to see if they were communists or not. And you want to know how many communists they found? None. They found zero. There weren't any, or at least none that were proved. By the way, the reason that they could do this, you might go, wow, that sounds totally unconstitutional. What about like the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure? What about the Third Amendment? People coming into my home. What about the Fifth Amendment, due process? Like, what about all this stuff? Well, actually, one of the reasons I don't like Woodrow Wilson is he had passed something called the Sedition Act during World War I. And basically what the Sedition Act is made it illegal for people to criticize the government. But sneakily inside that, it effectively allowed the government to suspend your constitutional rights. And obviously that law was later declared unconstitutional and it can't be done. But it had been sneaky and nobody had paid attention to it because we were in a war. And because that law had not quite been repealed yet, it was used to raid innocent Americans' homes and drag them out in the streets and accuse them of being communists, and they weren't communists. And so this is really quite problematic. Another thing that you, as an American soldier, might have come back to is prohibition. In 1919, alcohol was prohibited. You could no longer sell or move alcohol. Now, here's what's important to point out. You could own alcohol. As long as you had it in your house before prohibition went into effect, it was good. You could move it anywhere in your house. That's fine. The problem was it became illegal the second you moved it out of your house. And you also couldn't sell it. Even if it was already in your house, even if the person drank it in your house, you can't sell it to them. You can use it. So the rich weren't really affected by this. This was, in effect, an attempt to restrict poor people from drinking alcohol. And remember, we talked about this in the Progressive Era, why they wanted this. It was going to reduce the amount of domestic violence. Alcohol leads men to beat women. That's just a true fact. Statistically, it's true, right? That's going to help. It's going to lower the incidence of drunk driving. There are already vehicles. There are already people being killed by alcohol. Again, statistically, absolutely true. The problem is that the alcohol culture of the United States did not die. People did not go, wow, this is actually better for me. People like alcohol. They like the effect it has. And effectively what prohibition did is rather than eliminate alcohol, it pushed it underground. And this actually causes problems. Number one, it becomes incredibly lucrative to be a criminal who runs alcohol. Ever heard of Al Capone and the gangsters of Chicago? They got their money from running alcohol and speakeasies, which were bars that hid themselves. And you had to know the password to get in. And it was kind of hidden from sight. And so we have this huge illegal activities, and eventually those illegal activities are going to include more things, illegal firearms, drugs, things like that, worse things than alcohol. Another problem is that people begin making their own alcohol. They can't manufacture it, so they begin making their own. And the problem with this is alcohol is actually one of those substances that you really need to carefully control. By the way, it's because it's poison, like it's literally ingesting poison. That's what it is. It has several interesting effects on humans, but obviously if you get the dosages wrong, you can kill yourself with alcohol. It is possible to drink yourself to death, and not as in like ruin your life. That's possible too, but you can literally kill yourself with alcohol poisoning. You can get so much of it in your bloodstream, you will die. And you can also combine it with other chemicals, some of which can have really, really bad effects. So because it all goes underground, the government's no longer involved in making sure alcohol is being manufactured the right way. Well, people started dying of drinking their own moonshine. That's usually what it's called, self-made alcohol, because it wasn't safe anymore. So prohibition, not super successful. By the way, we're going to have an entire lecture about prohibition. So that was just like super surface level, caused some problems. Now, the soldiers are coming back. They're coming back. Prohibition's in effect. Communism scares are all over the place. Millions of men are being demobilized. Remember, 4 million came back from Europe at least, along with several million more who hadn't quite made the trip. They'd been trained. They were ready to go. The war had ended. Many of them found out they had missed out on things. Most of them came back and found that there were no jobs. The American economy had expanded to produce war material, but now there was no one to buy. And in fact, many of the manufacturers actually reduced the number of jobs they had. And remember, all those jobs had been filled. All the soldiers that went off the war, they didn't have anything to do when they came back. Almost all of them missed out on the opportunity to get wealthy during the war. Almost everyone in the United States who had stayed had gotten a lot of money. The economy was roaring. But now those soldiers, they went and fought. They'd gotten paid, but they hadn't gotten paid much. In fact, the only hope that these soldiers had was a bonus, a large cash payment the government had promised to pay them. The problem is that that payment was supposed to take more than 10 years, and many of these soldiers came back, had no jobs, had no economic prospects, and were poor. And they said, wait a second, I went over and I served my country. I sacrificed. I watched my friends die for my country. And yet the people who stayed home are the ones that benefited from my work, my behalf. And this is a problem, by the way. Very difficult problem. So what are they going to do about it? Well, the United States government is going to mishandle this badly. At first, it's not a big deal. The 1920s actually is in general a period of economic growth. So most of these soldiers don't get their bonuses, but they do find jobs eventually. It takes a few years, but they find jobs. But if you're familiar with the end of the 1920s, you know things are going to get bad, and that is the Great Depression. And these soldiers are going to find themselves with very little, and they're going to demand their bonuses, and the United States government is not going to handle it well. So I want you to be thinking about that. I know this has been a shorter lecture, but that's okay because we're kind of coming to an end of this section. You've got a study guide to work on, so I think that will fill your time nicely. Please be working on that. We will plan on having the test on Tuesday if we are back to school. And again, it could be that we've known we're not going to be in school for more than a week by the time you listen to this. But as of when I'm recording this, we have not gotten confirmation that we're going to be back to school. So plan on taking that test. The Tuesday we're back at school. If that is not the case, if we are doing distance learning for that third week or till the end of the semester, you will have the test in your weekly hub. And you can take that test anytime. Again, I'm just asking that your parents proctor that, and we'll talk more about that in in-class discussions and things like that. So don't worry about it. But just be aware that we will either have it on Tuesday if we're back at school, or we will have that at any time that week if we're not back at school. So just keep that in mind. All right. Hopefully you guys have a great week. Remember, take those quizzes, do well on them. Hopefully you're doing well in general. Also remember, I don't think I've repeated this on any of the lectures this week. There are worksheets for these lectures. Please make sure you fill them out so I can tell that you've actually watched these. Have a great week and a great weekend.